The Journey of Squarepeg, Chapter 9, 4 Become 5. The fears of hydrogen peroxide brought me back to reality. Hold still, my son instructed. As he cut strips from some waterproof plasters, my wife sat transfixed on our bed. A crop of bodies lay on the floor around her, oozing as she smeared their blood in a vain attempt to wipe it from her face. Having recovered my wits and strength enough, I set about removing them, all too aware of the horror they must present to my children. It took some time to drag them, heavy and blood-soaked, to the deck. I worked alone, Michael by now consoling a frightened Rose in the stern cabin. The last man I moved had sustained a deep incision to his Achilles tendon that I could not fathom. No wonder he had fallen. I'm unsure now if I recall the events accurately, but I often wondered at the miracle of that injury, unexplained as it was in its origin. Exhausted with the effort, I kicked each man under the handrail to fall into the water. As they plunged one by one, they smacked the deep green rain-pocked sea and sank slowly from view. Their only mark on earth was a trail of devastation. There was no ceremony for them, save my heavy breathing, hatred and disgust. Their blood-stained, rusting weapons followed as they served no purpose without ammunition. Only the shotgun was retained, though it contained just one cartridge. In the distance, the yacht barely floated, hanging low in the water as its pumps were overwhelmed. Perhaps our barge had dealt the final blow. There was no hope of retrieving the other cartridges safely. Neither could I stand the thought of those bodies again. It dawned on me that our assailants might be missed. My thoughts turned to putting distance between us and the patrol's main vessel, which I felt sure would set out to find its missing crew members. With this in mind, I started the engine and set my son to the wheel, asking him to hold his course and speed steady. It would take precious fuel, but I could not risk advertising our position. The sail would have to wait until we'd slipped away. Soon, with trepidation at what might lay ahead, I returned to our cabin to check on my wife. To my surprise, Helen was up, moving about, restless and distracted. She steadied herself on the curving walls as the boat rolled in the swell. Seeming not to notice the fine red mist airbrushed onto them. Unaware of my approach, she froze a moment, pressing her hand on her bulging stomach. "Are you okay?" I asked inadequately, still breathing heavily from the exertion. She turned, startled. A look of fear and desperation returned to my searching gaze. "I think it started," she replied with a quivering lip. Tears rolled from her eyes. I believed I knew what she was thinking. "Don't come near me," she breathed. A flash in her eye met my attempts to speak. I withdrew, partly through fear of her and partly through that of making the situation worse. All through the day we steamed southwest along the coast, the pirate dinghy in tow, changing our course often to throw our pursuers off the trail. As the day wore on, the weather intensified to a squall, and Helen's labours rose in sympathetic tempo until a crescendo of agony greeted the dusk. No matter how much medical training or experience you have, fighting your own fears and emotions when you face a medical emergency that affects your own is very challenging. My wife, who by now seemed almost unaware of my presence at her side, lost in a maelstrom of pain, panted desperately as the baby's forehead glided out. But on the next contraction, it advanced no further, rather remained half-crowned, turning more and more blue as the seconds ticked by. A whirlpool seemed to open up before me as panic began to take hold. Horrified, I fought to concentrate, trying to recall what I had read. Perhaps the shoulder, perhaps it was stuck. "Get out," she grunted in desperation as the splitting plane crashed over once more, intensifying until she was unable to utter a word. She was kneeling on the floor, the crown jutting preposterously from her. My mind was scrambled. Acting on impulse, unsure of the basis for my decision, I ordered her over onto her back and pulled her knees up to her chest. The next contraction began, but the head still did not advance. Instinctively, I leaned over her, pushed the flat of my palm down on the lump above her symphysis pubis. As the contraction began to abate, the head advanced, revealing the face of my child for the first time. As I tried to see if the cord was around her neck, my silent prayer was answered moments later as the final push delivered my child from her exhausted mother directly into my hand. In that early morning light, drenched in sweat, seasick and almost completely spent, the blood of life mingled with that spilled to protect it. After a frantic moment stimulating her to breathe, our boat was filled with the magic of her cries and the relieved and joyful weeping of its crew. After the third stage was complete and the child was wrapped in fresh, dry towels, Helen asked me to leave her, pulling the child to her breast and covering its head with her hand. Nodding, wiping tears from my eyes lest Rose should see them, I made my way on deck. We dropped anchor and slept through the night, too exhausted to care about the foul tempest that raged around us anymore, or even to think of mounting a watch. Finding a space at the foot of my daughter's bunk, I collapsed as if dead, my mind a whirling mass as the walls closed in around me. And after what seemed like hours lying wide-eyed, trying to process, I finally succumbed. Hours later, I awoke to find the sun shining through the porthole above my head. We were drifting about our anchor on a windless mill-pond sea. Roused at last by the cries of the gulls, I checked on my family, Helen at a distance through the splinters of our cabin door, then went on deck to scoop a bucket of water for our floors. My stinging face jarred as I grimaced in the sunlight and took in the vista of grass-topped cliffs just a mile away. It was a wonder that we had not run aground, for I had poor recollection of navigating in the chaos of the previous night. Blood, again, began to trickle from my cuts. I was spent, bruised and aching, unable to move without agony, but I was filled with life, almost overwhelmed by an urge to hold my baby aloft and roar at the gods. It helped me through the macabre operation of cleaning up the blood. Having completed this grisly task, washed and changed my clothes, my thoughts turned to food. As I sat by the boiling plate cooking noodles for my family, white caravans dotted the coastal slopes in a vast mosaic over what I guessed was Lizard Point. Seeking sustenance and comfort, my daughter nestled by Michael's side at the other end of the boat as they waited for the meal, silent, distant, clinging to his arm. Speaking softly, he coaxed her to practice tying her shoelaces, but she just shrugged and pulled a long face, clinging tighter still to his arm. The sense of peace was punctured by the silence of my wife below. Once the food was ready, I turned to my children, holding a plate for Helen. "Let's go and meet your sister." Michael began to stand, but Rose held him back. "Come on, Rose," he said. She shook her head and stayed rooted to the spot. "Don't you want to see her?" "Why not, sweetheart?" I asked gently. Rose's head bent down. Sad eyes stared at me from freckled sockets. She shook her head again. "What's wrong, darling?" "She is okay. She's very beautiful and she wants to meet her big sister." Rose did not react. I've never been good at understanding the female way of thinking, but I felt compelled to have another try. "Well, Mum would like you to see her. Don't you want to see her?" Still no reaction. Michael stood and made his way towards the wheelhouse. Suddenly realizing she would be left alone with me, Rose capitulated and followed him below. Perplexed, I slipped down with them, quietly entering the domain where her mother waited to introduce the children to the baby, who lay nestled in her arms, breastfeeding in a beam of sunlight lancing down on her from the grimy porthole. Tiny fingers gripped ours. When she opened them, her vernix-framed, puffy eyes were pools of liquid mercury. My daughter's held hands for just a second, neither knowing yet how important this bond would grow to be. My eldest took the teddy and showed it to the baby, who stared uncomprehending and returned to the breast. Concerned for her, my wife held Rose's forearm, pulled her close to kiss her, and settled her head again on the pillow, holding her breast to assist the baby and staring at her scalp. She paid little heed to me, making it clear that I was not welcome. "What'll we call her?" asked Rose, a little excited. "We haven't really thought that far ahead," I replied. After a while, Helen spoke with determination I had rarely heard in her voice. "Her name is Eve." There was no negotiation with me. It was a simple and quiet statement of fact. Eve meant life. It was a good choice. Feeling unwelcome, I left the room and, full of burning pain in my soul and my body, busied myself with reordering our craft as laughter and excited chatter came eventually from below. Alone above, Helen's 1,000-yard stare still burned on my retina. By nightfall, we were ready to raise the sail and round the point. Unable to sleep, full of thoughts and mixed emotions, the gore of life and death poured relentlessly through my mind. I settled at the wheel and guided us through the star-strewn night, distracted as I sailed with the thoughts of the evil that men do.